Good evening and welcome to the second session of our Autumn-Term Money webinar series by the Institute of International Monetary Research in collaboration with the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. I'm Dr. Juan Castañeda, Director of the IIMR, and today we'll be hosting Professor Steve Hanke. Steve Hanke is a professor of applied economics and founder and co-director of the Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in the US. He is a senior fellow and director of the Troubled Currencies Project at the Cato Institute in Washington, DC, a senior advisor at the Renmin University of China's International Monetary Research Institute in Beijing, a special counselor to the Center for Financial Stability in New York, a contributing editor at Central Banking in London, and a contributor at National Review. Professor Hanke is also a member of the Charter Council of the Society of Economic Measurement and of Euromoney Country Risk Expert Panel. In 2020, Professor Hanke was named a Knight of the Order of the Flag by Albanian President Ilir Meta. Steve Hanke has held senior policy advisory positions, both in the US and abroad, and has played an important role in establishing new currency regimes in different countries, such as Argentina, Estonia, Bosnia, or Ecuador, among many others. Professor Hanke is a well-known currency and commodity trader. Currently, he serves as chairman of the supervisory board of Advanced Metallurgical Group NV in Amsterdam and chairman emeritus of the Friedberg Mercantile Group in Toronto. During the 90s, he served as president of Toronto Trust Argentina in Buenos Aires, the world's best performing emerging market mutual fund in 1995. Today, we will discuss alternative monetary regimes to fight inflation in emerging economies, dollarization, currency boards, and monetary competition, after which we'll allow time for a QA time with viewers at home. Today's presentation will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. Questions must be submitted via the Q&A option on Zoom, and I will moderate them and address the speaker. Steve, as you have said, is also a member of the IIMR's Academic Advisory Council, and we are very grateful for his continued support of our research agenda. Thank you very much, Steve, for accepting our invitation to contribute to our webinar series. So the floor is entirely yours. Thank you.
Well, Juan, thank you for that kind introduction and the invitation to address the audience. Today, I will focus my remarks on exchange rate regimes and how they relate to monetary and fiscal policies and what types of systems are most appropriate, particularly in emerging market countries. But before I do that, let me set the stage. There are three types, generic types of exchange rate systems: floating, fixed, and pegged systems. And there are six characteristics that I look at that are associated with these different types of systems. The floating system is one in which there is no exchange rate policy, but there is a monetary policy, and the source of the monetary base in a floating rate system is domestic. There are no conflicts between exchange rate and monetary policies because there's only a monetary policy, not an exchange rate policy. There are not balance of payments crises in pure floating rate systems, and they're not exchange controls. If we go to the other extreme, the fixed exchange rate, we have an exchange rate policy. We have no monetary policy. All of the source or thrust for the monetary base is foreign based. There are no conflicts between exchange rate and monetary policies because there is no monetary policy. There are no balance of payments crises, and there are no exchange rate controls. The third system, which actually is the most common system, particularly in emerging market countries, it's almost universal, with some exceptions, which we'll get into, important exceptions. But the peg system, there is an exchange rate policy, there is a monetary policy. Domestic and foreign sources make up the monetary base. There are conflicts or potential conflicts between monetary policy and exchange rate policy. There are often balance of payments crises, and there are also often exchange controls. Now, as I said, the peg system is the most common, and you have all sorts of pegs. We got peg but adjustable, falling pegs, band, managed floats, all of those things fit into this generic category of what I refer to as pegs. As a general remark, I would say that in emerging market countries, these are nothing but trouble. As I indicated, a balance of payments crises can rear their ugly heads. You have conflicts between exchange rate policies and monetary policies, and often you have exchange controls. So I won't say anything more about pegs right now. Let me jump briefly to floating. There are a few places that have floating exchange rates. One happens to be the United States, and I will mention what's going on in the United States just as a remark today. John Greenwood and I have been working intensely on analyzing the monetary policy of the United States. Of course, we're floating, so we have no exchange rate policy in the United States. We do have a monetary policy. It's not based on any kind of look at broad money or narrow money or the money supply. In fact, in February, Chairman Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve System, stated that M2, which is the broadest measure of money that the Fed reports, is irrelevant and has no connection to inflation or real economic activity, in short, nominal GDP. He just dismissed it completely. Well, this turns out to be a real problem in the United States because Greenwood and I have a way to visualize this, and that is with the Greenwood-Hanke bathtub. And if you look at the picture since COVID started, and you think of the bathtub, a bathtub, you have money going in through the faucet. About $5.5 trillion has gone in through the faucet. And if we analyze going forward until the end of 2024, Greenwood and I think there'll be about $5 trillion more put into the bathtub if the Fed tapers and brings the money supply growth down to the 5 to 6% range per annum. So you've got roughly $10.5 trillion in the bathtub by the end of 2024, and you've got two drains coming out of the bathtub. One fuels real economic activity, and the other accommodates the increased demand for money, just the reciprocal of the velocity of money. Those two drains combined will take about a third of the money that's gone into the bathtub out of the bathtub. So you're left with 2/3 of that $10.5 trillion input that is excess money in the system. And that will go over the inflation overflow drain. And this has led Greenwood and I to conclude that we will have, again, back to MV equals PY, the equation of exchange, working through the arithmetic of all that with the excess money coming out of the overflow drain, of course, with a 2-year lag or something like that before it actually hits inflation. We're going to have persistent inflation of around 6% from at the end of this year, at the end of next year, at the end of the next year, and probably well into 2024. So that's the floating system, and how one analyzes a floating system. And again, with a visual, think the Greenwood-Hanke bathtub, and you've got a pretty good picture of a huge amount of excess money in the bathtub, and it's going to go out the overflow, and we are going to have persistent inflation. Forget supply chain problems and all these ad hoc reasons and nonsense about the causes of inflation under the US floating exchange rate regime. Now let's move quickly into the heart of what I really want to talk about, and that's the fixed rate system. And the fixed rate system, there are two ways to do this. One is with dollarization, and that is you just simply get rid of the local currency and replace it with some foreign currency, which we call generically dollarization. Actually, there are about 33 countries that are dollarized and with many different kinds of currencies. Liechtenstein uses the Swiss franc. Montenegro, in which I introduced the German mark in December of 1999, when I was President Djukanovich's chief advisor. We Deutschmark Montenegro, and now they, of course, use the euro. Kosovo uses the euro, although they're formally not part of the Eurozone. And then we have big dollarization episodes or countries in Latin America. Panama has been dollarized for over 100 years. In 2000, I helped put in dollarization in Ecuador. 2001, El Salvador was dollarized. So that's the dollarization scheme. I'm not going to really talk further about that right now. I'm going to jump into the second way to implement or accommodate the fixed rate regime, and that's with a currency board system. Now, with a currency board system, you have a fixed exchange rate. The exchange rate is fixed to an anchor currency, and that anchor or reserve currency provides 100% backing for the domestic issue of the money. There are no exchange controls. They're free convertibility at that fixed exchange rate. So the local currency becomes, in effect, a clone of whatever the anchor is. Now, just a little background on how I was introduced to this, because it relates to people that you all know. Sir Alan Walters was one of my best friends, obviously, and colleague at Johns Hopkins University. And at about the time John Greenwood was designing the blueprint for the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the reintroduction of a currency board system in 1983 after the huge currency crisis that almost crushed Hong Kong, Walters informed me about this because he knew John. He was involved in this process at the time. As you recall, he was Maggie Thatcher's economic guru, and at that time, Hong Kong was still a colony, and at that time, Mrs. Thatcher ultimately green-lighted Greenwood's proposal after a good and thorough briefing by Sir Alan. So I became introduced to currency boards with Alan and actually John at that time. And at that time, by the way, I was engaged in very microeconomics. I was not into international exchange rate regimes and that sort of thing. I was designing the classical things like the optimum diameter for a water wastewater system pipe or sewerage system, and in fact, I can tell you that those design criteria that I developed are still used actually in Europe. The Hanke design criteria for sewer interceptors are still widely used. So I went from the most micro kind of thing to this big picture kind of macro thing, thanks to Sir Alan and ultimately Greenwood. Then the opportunity came along. I had a postdoctoral student, Dr. Kurt Schuler, who I work with still all the time on currency boards, a postdoctoral student who actually did an internship with Greenwood in Hong Kong. That's by way of background of how I got into this currency board idea and also dollarization. Historically, there have been about 70 currency boards with these fixed exchange rate systems. None have ever failed. But today, there are only about 15 of them. Hong Kong being, of course, a big premier one, but the other modern ones, I had a hand in doing the architecture and doing what Greenwood did in Hong Kong and for Estonia in 1992, Lithuania in 1994, Bulgaria in 1997, and also Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1997. So now there are in total only about 15 currency boards. So you ask the question, how in the world, if these systems work perfectly, there's never been a failure, and that even includes the one that Keynes was the architect for in North Russia in 1918, right in the middle of the Civil War. It worked like a charm. Everyone was ultimately able to redeem all of their North Russian rubles at the fixed exchange rate, because even after the Civil War, the reserves were all safe and sound in London. So redemption occurred virtually 100% of it without a problem. So why so few now? This was right after World War II. Most of these currency boards were British colonial institutions. So that was verboten after independence started, after World War II. Got to get rid of everything that was colonial, everything that smacked of colonialism, even though it worked like a charm. So that was the first point. The second point is that Keynesian economics, Keynesianism had come in strong at that point, and that means fine tuning. And you need a central bank to fine tune. You must have a monetary policy. Well, a currency board has no monetary policy, and no fine tuning is allowed. So that was another negative. The third negative happened to be the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. Remember, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and you need central banks because you need jobs for the boys. The boys at the IMF and the World Bank needed to provide technical assistance to newly independent countries for something. And what better than establishing a big central bank that no one knew anything about, and whatever the independent country happened to be. So you send in teams from the IMF and World Bank to sort it out. So I think that's my analysis of why we don't find many currency boards today. My next point on these exchange rate regimes is confusions. There's a great deal of confusion about the exchange rate regimes, and most of it is because economists really don't read the literature. They don't understand the literature. They don't know the history of things. They literally don't know what they're doing in most cases. Milton Friedman wrote an article in 1953, very influential, called The Case for Flexible Exchange Rates. As a result, everybody, particularly free market type people and people in that chapel, people following Milton, just conclude that, oh, we have to be for floating exchange rates. We can't be for currency boards and fixed exchange rates. Nonsense. Friedman was a big advocate for fixed exchange rates and currency boards in emerging market countries. He was very involved with the work John Greenwood was doing in the Hong Kong case. He endorsed my proposal for a currency board in Estonia, a currency board that was ultimately put in place in June of 1992. He also endorsed my currency board proposals for Indonesia in 1998, and on you go. So if you read what Friedman actually has done in action and all what he's written, you will find a big fixed exchange rate advocate for emerging market countries in Milton Friedman. I have written about this in an article I wrote in the Cato Journal, you can, for your reference, with all the relevant references and so forth. So that's one big confusion. A lot of free market people think that currency boards are not free market, and they think that because they've never really studied the thing very carefully. And somehow, given this article and Friedman to see a floating for big exchange rates, like, he was very opposed to the Bretton Woods system, for example. So for the big countries involved in Bretton Woods, he was opposed to the pegged exchange rate arrangement under Bretton Woods, and he was an advocate of floating. Another big confusion surrounding currency boards is Argentina. Argentina, Kurt Schuler and I wrote a book at the request of Carlos Menem, who'd just been elected president of Argentina in 1989. And the idea, it was all Orthodox currency board, as I've described it. Ultimately, to get rid of the triple-digit inflation that was facing Argentina at the time and get the show on the road, Argentina adopted what they called a convertibility system. And the convertibility system did have a fixed exchange rate between the peso and the dollar, and it did require high levels of reserves, but it wasn't a currency board. It was a pegged exchange rate system. It had loopholes in it which didn't comport with the proposal that Schuler and I had written up. The loopholes which I wrote about, this was installed in April of 1991, and by September, October, I was writing articles in the Wall Street Journal, and the articles were saying the system should be reformed and made into a currency board system instead of this convertibility system. And if it didn't change, the system would eventually blow up. So what were the loopholes? One is that under certain circumstances, the central bank could hold less than 100% reserve cover. Two, the dollar reserves that were held not only could be less than 100%, but some of those dollar reserves could be Argentine government bonds denominated in US dollars. That's a no-no in a currency board. The domestic currency cannot be anchored by bonds issued by the domestic government. They all have to be foreign bonds issued and denominated in whatever the anchor is. The third thing is that there's a huge amount of discretion allowed in the convertibility system. The net domestic assets were not fixed. If you look at the balance sheet, they were going all over the place. This is a no-no with a currency board. A currency board, the only source of the monetary changes in the monetary base or changes in the foreign reserves that are held at the currency board. Another way to look at this discretion thing, the convertibility had a variable floor in it, and it had no ceiling in it for the foreign reserves. So you could engage in a tremendous amount of sterilization, which they did with reckless abandon in Argentina. The only other point I'd like to make about Argentina is that the central bank in its modern form was established in 1935, and the only period of time where the central bank performed over a fairly long period of time with single-digit inflation was the 10-year period in which convertibility was in use. So convertibility might have had lots of flaws and everything, but it's the only decade in which the central bank in Argentina has performed admirably well. let me conclude my opening remarks with this, and that is something that Professor Armin Alchin conveyed to me in 1966 at a seminar in Charlottesville, Virginia, the University of Virginia. Alchin was giving a lecture, and he's always started every lecture and every seminar he ever gave to students, and I was a student at the time, by indicating that you had to be careful when you read the professional literature, because Armin had a 95% rule. A 95% rule was 95% of whatever you read is either wrong or irrelevant. That rule is golden and holds. And if you read about anything on exchange rate regimes and more broadly monetary policy, you'll find that 95% of what's written in the professional literature is either wrong or irrelevant. And Juan, I think with that, I'd like to suggest that you open the floor for questioning. I have no problem with monetary competition because I helped Manuel Hines when they installed the exchange rate regime law and dollarization law in 2001 in El Salvador. And that particular law is a competitive currency regime in the following sense. We got rid of the local currency and replaced it with the US dollar, and that became legal tender. The dollar is legal tender in El Salvador, but everything else is legal too. And of course, it is a competitive currency regime in that sense. Now, the preference, consumer sovereignty prevails, therefore, but everyone uses the dollar. It's the other currencies, even though they're totally legal, although they're not, don't have the legal tender status, are not used very much, almost never used. It's always a greenback. I prefer the proven solution, and the proven solution is a currency board. That is the best way to get rid of inflation if you want a domestic currency. The other option is you just take the law in El Salvador and repeat it. That is a competitive currency law, and if you don't want a currency board, you can go that way with a dollarization. So either way, right now, for example, Lebanon is going through a tremendous economic crisis. And when we have a Johns Hopkins working group on Lebanon, made up of John Greenwood, myself, and Jacques de la Rosière in Paris, and we're advocating a currency board system for Lebanon. The reason we are doing that is to some extent political, because they clearly have a political preference for the retention of the Lebanese pound there, and not dollarization. So the law would be one in which we had a currency board, and the Lebanese pound was anchored to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate, but everything else would be legal. So it would be open. There would be no restrictions on foreign currency accounts of any kind, whether they be dollar or euro or Syrian pounds or anything else. Yeah, there would be legal in the proposal that we have for Lebanon. The legal tender would be the Lebanese pound issued by a currency board anchored by the US dollar. It would be a clone of the US dollar, and everything else would be legal. Okay. The other alternative, my kind of vision for, shall we say, a competitive currency regime in practice. By the way, unlike a lot of the people who talk about things a lot and never do anything, I'm a practical person. I'm talking about real things I've actually done. I actually have dollarized countries, and I actually have stopped inflation with currency boards. I've actually stopped a huge hyperinflation in 1997 in Bulgaria. The inflation rate was 242% per month.
Mm-hmm.
I stopped that within 30 days. Inflation was down to single digits after the installation of the currency board in July of 1997. So when I talk about competitive currency regimes, I'm not talking about airy-fairy theory or anything. I'm talking about a law like the one that was put in El Salvador, and that is one in which the colon, the local currency, was mothballed and put in a museum, and the dollar replaced it as legal tender, and everything else was free and open. Of course, it goes without saying. If the Hong Kong dollar is a clone of the U.S. dollar, through arbitrage, you're going to have inflation that mirrors the inflation rate in the United States. It might not be exactly the same, but it will mirror the tendencies and be very close to the anchor currency. So what? Emerging market countries have crap for currencies, and terrible inflation problems are prevalent. And if they have a currency board anchored to any halfway decent anchor, so much the better. And with the currency board laws that we have, and the currency board, one advantage of the currency board is that you have, at least with the currency board laws that Schuler and I have always drafted, you have an automatic rule that allows for a switch of the anchor. Let's say the anchor goes terribly bad. What do? If you have a currency board, you just switch the anchor. And you don't do it in an ad hoc way. You have it embedded in the currency board law itself, the procedure and rules under which you transition from anchor A to anchor B. I think this is another one of those debating points that it's one of the Armanelchian 95%. It's an irrelevant point. It's not going to move the needle one way or another, for God's sakes. Of course, these are profit-making operations. The currency board system is one in which the liabilities issued by the currency board pay no interest, and all the assets, the reserve assets, earn interest in the reserve currency. So they're a money-making machine. Now, dollarization is a different issue. If you dollarize, unless you have a seigniorage agreement with whatever the dollarized, whether it's a Swiss franc or euro or US dollar, unless you have some arrangement with the anchor or the substitute currency that you're using, you do lose seigniorage. You don't pick up seigniorage, but you gain the key thing in either a dollarized system or a currency board system. The main thing, it is not monetary economics. Everybody, all the economists writing about this are confused, and they never get the main point, which is very typical of most economists. The main point with a currency board system or a dollarized system is fiscal. It puts a hard budget constraint in the fiscal authorities, and it does that because the monetary authority under a currency board or under a dollarized system cannot extend credit or monetize any deficit that's issued or a result of fiscal policy of whatever the country happens to be. So The key thing is a hard budget constraint. Now, let me tell you a story about this. In 1992, in June of 1992, June 20th, we installed a currency board in Estonia. At that time, the Russian ruble was the currency. Estonia had just become independent. They didn't even have a new constitution, by the way. I gave a speech in May in Tallinn and sold it actually was the Supreme Soviet then. I addressed the Supreme Soviet in Estonia in May. On June 20th, we installed a currency board. We got rid of the Russian ruble. We started issuing a krone. It was 100% backed by Deutschmarks, traded at a fixed exchange rate with Deutschmarks. There was no reserve problem because as World War II broke out and the Estonians put their gold reserves in London for safekeeping, so we had plenty of reserves. That wasn't a problem. And the thing worked like a charm. No inflation, hard budget constraint, everything worked smoothly. The Prime Minister of Lithuania paid a visit to Estonia, saw the hard budget constraint. He was a former communist, head of the socialist at the time. I was his advisor. I became his advisor upon his invitation right after he went to Estonia, because he asked the Estonians who designed the system. They said, well, Professor Hanke did. So he called me. Mrs. Hanke and I were in Paris. We went to Vilnius immediately. And by the end of our introductory lunch, he'd already adopted the currency board, or said that he would. And why? Why? He understood. He's one of the few politicians who understood immediately the hard budget constraint. Even though the socialists controlled the parliament, the prime minister, who is the leader of that party, could not control a parliament and couldn't control a budget, couldn't control a deficit. He wanted to put his colleagues in a straitjacket, a fiscal straitjacket. So the currency board. And that was the main motivation. And as far as I know, that's the only case in which a politician actually understood exactly what the hard budget constraint was. And that is the key to the whole thing. Forget all the monetary economics and that kind of thing. The key is the hard budget constraint. None of the modern models have money in the model. So it's so bad. It's almost unbelievable. I would say the incompetence of the practitioners is just mind-boggling. I mean, it's as if they've never heard of the equation of exchange. Or money. And you get all kinds of strange things going on. Let's go back to the floating exchange rate thing, a point that I'd like to make. Ben Bernanke was chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve System, as you know, distinguished economist, and the U.S. is floating. So he had 6 items on his dashboard that he watched to make his judgments about monetary policy in the United States and the tone of monetary policy. Since we were floating, he did not have the dollar-euro exchange rate or any kind of exchange rate for the dollar vis-a-vis an index or anything else on his dashboard. It was not one of the 6 things. So this is what goes on in the real world. I mean, you get all these lapses. How in the world could the chairman of the Federal Reserve not have the most important, probably the most important price in the world? As Bob Mundell always used to say, the most important price in the world is a dollar-euro exchange rate. Related to this, of course, I mentioned before, something that drives you and Tim Congdon nuts with, and it should, is that the U.S., the broadest measure of money that they report is M2, And M2 doesn't even have large time deposits in it.
Mm-hmm.
So M2 is a kind of a restricted measure of what we normally would think of as M2. And certainly M3 isn't even reported. And the only place you can actually get a broad measure in the United States is the shadow committee that even Tim used for M3, or if you want to go to M4, you can go to the Center for Financial Stability, and Bill Burnett's measures for M4 can be given either in a divisia form or as a simple sum form. You can get M4 from that Center for Financial Stability in New York.
Yes, as you know, what we do here from the Institute is to continue with what it used to be the M3 monetary aggregate published by the Federal Reserve up to 2006, and that's our preferred monetary aggregate, a broad one, including most of bank deposits.
What countries in Europe have the lowest debt to GDP ratios? Well, the lowest one happens to be Estonia. Now they've transitioned out of their currency board, and they're a formal member of the euro now. But they got the discipline with the currency board. The second one, close behind, is Bulgaria. Bulgaria has the second lowest debt to GDP ratio of any member of the European Union. And it's because the currency board gives much more discipline, by the way, than the euro itself. And that's why I'm opposed to the introduction of the euro and the formal joining of the Eurozone by Bulgaria. And the reason for that is that if you join the Eurozone, there is a much higher degree of moral hazard associated with bad fiscal policy. Just look at Greece. Greece was a member, and there was a huge moral hazard. They knew Brussels would bail them out, and they went wild. In Bulgaria, they've had every kind of government under the sun. It's a very corrupt system, and a very disciplined fiscal operation. No matter, it doesn't make any difference whether the socialists are in, coalition are in, whether the conservatives are in. They all more or less balance the budget. He didn't get the proper definitions. When I went through the generic types, those are all pegged exchange rates. They're designed to blow up. They have both monetary policies and exchange rate policies. They have discretionary monetary policy. You cannot, with a currency board, have a monetary policy. It has no monetary policy. All the Middle Eastern systems are junk. They're all pegs, and they'll all blow up, and you'll always have balance of payments problems, occasional exchange controls, conflicts between monetary policy and exchange rate policy. And this is a perfect time for me to get kind of hard-nosed and say, this is why most economists are confused and lost. They don't even know what a fixed exchange rate system is. The fixed exchange rate system cannot have monetary policy, period. I'll defer to one of my mentors, Milton Friedman, on this. If you have a very big country like the United States, a big economy, and furthermore, what would be the anchor for the United States? If the United States had a currency board, well, they could have gold. Now, gold isn't issued by another sovereign, and they could, in effect, go on a gold standard. But I think as a practical matter, the United States is one example. Now, one place that Milton and I disagreed, both John Greenwood, Alan Walters, Sir Alan, and I proposed a currency board even for mainland China. And Milton didn't like that idea. He thought China was too big, it was this big in a matter of size. And in politics, now, if mainland China had a currency board, what would the anchor be? Well, logically, it would be the US dollar. Now you can see that's going no place. I mean, as a practical thing, it's not going to happen. So the easiest way to look at the movement in both, obviously, the foreign exchange and net domestic assets, and the key is they have to be going in opposite directions. Then you know you have a problem. Let's say here's the typical currency crisis in emerging market countries that have pegged exchange rate. The foreign exchange starts dwindling away. It starts going down. So that component of the monetary base starts declining. And the monetary authorities want to keep the money supply growing. And so they start substituting the decline in the foreign exchange in the net foreign assets with net domestic assets. So they start pumping up the net domestic assets. And then any good currency speculator knows they're in trouble. The proportion of the high-powered money being produced by the central bank that's backed by foreign exchange will become less and less. And you know there's neutralization going on, or sterilization. Now it can be the other way. You could have a big increase in FX reserves, and you start seeing a big decline in net domestic assets, and you know they're sterilizing. So you have to look at the balance sheet and the net domestic assets and net foreign assets. They're not very widely produced. There are almost no central banks that produce divisia. I think I might be mistaken. Bill Barnett told me this once, but there are some that produce them internally and keep them private. But I think Israel might be the only central bank that's producing divisia and making it public. So that's the one. I mean, they're just not produced. Now, the deeper question is, well, why aren't they produced? And I honestly don't have a good answer for that. I mean, the only one producing reliable divisia in the United States is Barnett.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not positive about this. I don't think, and Barnett would have to correct me on this, but I don't think the Fed even internally produces divisia anymore.
All right, Steve, you've been really, really kind, addressing all the questions, comments, and very generous with your time. So thank you very much for your excellent presentation and for the Q&A time with our audience. Thank you for your time. I look forward to having you again with us very soon. So thank you very much, Steve, and thank you very much for all of you, all the viewers from home.
Thank you, Juan.